The forest was too quiet. That was the first warning. It was December 1944, deep in the Ardennes, where snow fell in heavy curtains and muffled even the sound of fear. An American patrol moved cautiously through the trees, rifles raised, boots sinking into fresh drifts of white. Their breath came out in sharp clouds. Their nerves were stretched thin. They had been told the enemy was everywhere. German units had launched a surprise counterattack days earlier. Roads vanished under artillery. Towns were swallowed by fog. Rumors spread faster than orders. Entire companies disappeared into the forest, swallowed by a silence that never felt natural. So when Sergeant Miller raised his fist to signal a halt, the patrol stopped instantly. No one spoke. No one moved. Only the forest breathed. The men scanned the tree line, expecting the familiar terror: a muzzle flash, a hidden MG-42 nest, a sniper waiting for one wrong step. Every shadow felt alive. Every branch looked like a rifle. Private Dawson whispered, "They're close. I feel it." The others felt it too. They advanced slowly, deeper into the pines, boots crunching in rhythm. The patrol expected the next moment to explode with fire. They expected to see enemy soldiers behind every tree. They expected death waiting in silence. But then they heard it. Not gunfire. Not footsteps. Not commands in German. A faint, fragile sound. Crying. Sergeant Miller froze. So did the entire patrol. The crying came again, soft and trembling, carried by cold wind as if the forest itself was confessing something. The men exchanged confused looks. No one knew what to make of it. Miller signaled forward. They moved toward the sound, weapons still raised, because anything could be a trap. They followed the cries through a narrow trail, around a bend of frost-covered pines, past a fallen tree. What they discovered made the entire patrol stop dead in their tracks. Not Germans with rifles. Not ambush positions. But children, German children, huddled together under a broken wooden cart, shivering violently, their faces streaked with tears and soot. A little girl clutched a blanket. A boy hid behind her. The youngest, barely able to walk, reached out with frost-bitten fingers. The patrol lowered their rifles in pure disbelief. This was no ambush. This was survival. This was fear that had nothing to do with uniforms. And in that moment, the Americans realized something far more devastating than any enemy attack. These children had been hiding from everyone. Before the American patrol found the children in the woods, the Ardennes had already become a place where certainty died. What was once a quiet, snow-covered forest had turned into one of the most unpredictable battlegrounds of the war. Soldiers didn't trust the silence anymore. They didn't trust paths, footprints, or even the wind. The month was December 1944, and the Battle of the Bulge was unfolding with terrifying speed. American forces, spread thin and exhausted, suddenly found themselves under a massive German offensive. Entire divisions were caught off guard. Supply lines were broken. Radios failed. And the forest, usually an ally that offered cover, became a labyrinth where friend and foe seemed to change places by the hour. The patrol that morning belonged to a weary American infantry unit tasked with scouting a route toward a nearby village that had gone silent. Reports had come in that German forces were using disguised soldiers, false checkpoints, and hidden firing positions in the woods. Every step they took was a risk. The patrol sergeant, a steady man hardened by months of fighting, had learned to read the forest like a map of danger. He watched how snow shifted under boots, how birds scattered too quickly, how branches snapped without reason. The Ardennes taught him to listen to things most people never noticed. Behind him marched 8 men, cold, hungry, and running on instinct. Their faces were tight with tension. Their gloves were stiff with frost. Some whispered prayers into the collars of their jackets. Others walked in a silence thick enough to break. But beneath all the fear and discipline was a truth none of them said out loud. Everyone in those woods was just trying to survive. American, German, civilian, soldier, child. The faint crying they later heard did not match anything they had been briefed for. Yet the origins of those heartbreaking sounds could be traced to the chaos of the days before. When the German offensive began, entire civilian families fled from their villages. Some ran toward American lines hoping for protection. Others hid in barns, root cellars, or the deep woods. A few families never made it out at all. Many were separated in the confusion. Parents dragged away by instructions, gunfire, or the desperate need to search for food. Roads were dangerous. Forest paths were deadly. And the Ardennes cold did not forgive anyone, not even children. The small group the patrol would find had likely been traveling with adults who never returned. Maybe taken by retreating German units, maybe killed, maybe lost in the blinding snowstorm that swept the forest 2 days earlier. They hid under the broken cart because it was the only shelter they could find. The cracked wood kept off snow but not the cold. The children had likely survived only because they huddled together for warmth. The patrol didn't know any of this as they approached the clearing. But something in the forest felt wrong. Unease crawled along the sergeant's spine long before they heard the cries. He raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. To their left, tall pines blocked all view. To their right, dense brush made visibility impossible. The forest ahead opened just enough to reveal a faint trail of disturbed snow, not from boots but from small dragging feet. Private Russell whispered, "Tracks, but small ones." Small enough that the men grew more alert. There were stories, too many stories, about traps set with the help of misinformation. American soldiers had been ambushed by German units dressed in captured uniforms. Others had been lured into kill zones. So when they heard the first soft cry, no one believed it. The noise echoed strangely, bouncing off trees like something unreal. A second cry followed, thin and choked, carried by the icy wind. It didn't sound like a soldier. It didn't sound like fear of combat. It sounded like a child afraid of the dark. The patrol exchanged glances, skeptical, cautious, yet drawn forward by something deeper than training. The sergeant signaled with 2 fingers. Advance slowly. They moved as if approaching danger, rifles up, breaths tight. Every instinct told them it was wrong. Every instinct told them it could be a trap. But the closer they crept, the more the crying became undeniably human. Not staged. Not masked. Just raw suffering. And when they stepped around the cluster of trees and saw the broken cart, half collapsed, dusted in snow, they realized their worst fear was not an ambush. Their worst fear was that they were too late. 3 children huddled underneath, a girl clutching a threadbare blanket, a boy trying to shield her, and a toddler barely conscious. No footprints of adults nearby. No signs of shelter. No food. No heat. In the middle of a frozen battlefield, the patrol found the last thing they expected. Not enemies. Not danger. But innocence. Abandoned, terrified, and fading. For a long moment, none of the American soldiers moved. The forest around them seemed to inhale and hold its breath, as if waiting to see what these armed men, trained for survival, hardened by months of terror, would do when confronted not by enemies, but by children who had run out of time. The sergeant lowered his rifle first. Slowly, deliberately. The others followed, stunned and wordless. The eldest child, a girl no older than 10, stared at them with wide, hollow eyes. Her lips were blue. Her hands trembled as she tried to pull the thin blanket tighter around the younger ones. The boy beside her, maybe 7, shifted to place himself between the soldiers and his siblings. Brave, protective, trembling. And the smallest, a toddler, lay limp against the girl's shoulder, too weak even to cry. The patrol had seen many terrible things in the war. But this was different. This was suffering without ideology, without uniform, without guilt. Private Dawson knelt first, removing his gloves despite the cold. "It's okay," he whispered softly, even though he wasn't sure they understood him. The girl flinched. The sergeant stepped forward carefully, hands open. "We're not going to hurt you," he said, his voice unsteady. "You're safe." But were they? In that frozen forest, surrounded by armies that cared nothing for innocence, safety was a fragile word. The men knew they had to act fast. The Ardennes cold was lethal even to grown soldiers. For children who had gone days without warmth or food, every second mattered. Check the area, the sergeant ordered quietly. No surprises. 2 soldiers swept the perimeter, rifles raised, scanning for movement, adult footprints, enemy patrols, anything out of place. But there was nothing. Only deep snow, broken branches, and the fading imprint of small feet. When they returned, Private Ellis said what the sergeant had already understood. They're alone. They've been alone a while. The sergeant swallowed hard. We can't leave them here. HQ said civilians are to be sent to the rear, another soldier murmured. We're behind lines, sure, but that doesn't mean. We're not leaving them, the sergeant repeated, this time with steel in his voice. War had taken enough. The girl's fear gradually loosened when the Americans put down their weapons. She loosened her grip on the blanket, just enough for the men to see the toddler's face. A ripple of shock passed through the patrol. The child was burning with fever. His breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. His cheeks were sunken. His eyelids fluttered weakly. Private Russell whispered, "He won't make it another hour." The sergeant acted instantly. He removed his own winter jacket and wrapped it around the little boy, cradling him with the gentleness of someone who had once held a child before the war erased those memories. The girl whispered something in German. Soft, frightened, pleading. "We don't understand," Dawson said gently. "But we're going to help. I promise." The girl's gaze lingered on his eyes, searching for the truth in a language she didn't speak. Slowly, she nodded. Getting them out of the forest would not be easy. The patrol was deep in territory where enemy units were still active. Gunfire could erupt at any moment. Adding children to the group made them slower, more vulnerable, more exposed. But there was no decision to make. The sergeant only said one thing. "We move. Now." He picked up the toddler himself. Dawson took the girl by the hand. Ellis guided the boy, whose legs shook from cold. The rest formed a defensive circle, scanning the tree line constantly as they began their trek back. Snow continued to fall, slow, heavy flakes that blurred distance and made every direction look the same. They walked in silence, guided by instinct and memory of the route. Every sound made them tense. The creak of branches, the crack of ice, the distant rumble of artillery. And then, halfway back, they heard something else. Distant shouting. German voices. The sergeant signaled immediately. Down. He lowered the toddler to the ground carefully, still wrapped in his coat. The children curled together. The patrol formed a protective arc around them, rifles aimed outward. The voices grew louder, bootsteps crunching through the snow. "That's not a small group," Ellis whispered. "Sounds like a whole squad." The Americans tensed. If the Germans found them, there would be a firefight. And the children, already fragile, freezing, terrified, would be caught in the center. The sergeant made a silent decision. He raised his hand, signaling his men to hold fire unless attacked. They waited, breaths held. Through the trees, a German patrol emerged. Exhausted soldiers marching in the opposite direction, unaware of the Americans not 20 yards away. Their faces looked as worn and frightened as the forest itself. The German squad passed, and kept walking, never noticing the Americans hidden behind the thick pines. Only when the last helmet disappeared into the distance did the sergeant exhale. "That was too close," someone whispered. But the sergeant looked at the children and shook his head. "Close doesn't matter. Alive does." They resumed their march. The forest seemed even colder now, even quieter. The little boy in the sergeant's arms whimpered weakly. The girl stumbled. The patrol's urgency grew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they saw movement through the trees. Not enemy soldiers. Not danger. American helmets. The outer line of their division's encampment. The sergeant signaled to the guards. "We found civilians," he shouted. "Children. Get a medic." The encampment stirred instantly. Soldiers rushed forward. Blankets were brought. A medic sprinted across the snow. The children were lifted gently from the patrol's arms, rushed toward a heated tent. The sergeant and his men stood there, breathing hard, frozen to the bone, shaken to their core. They had expected an ambush in those woods. But what they found instead was something far more heartbreaking, far more human. Innocence abandoned in a war that no longer cared who suffered. The medic's tent glowed faintly through the falling snow, a warm blur in a world of frozen white. The American patrol followed close behind as stretchers and blankets were rushed inside. Inside that canvas shelter, the war momentarily felt far away, muted by the soft hum of lanterns and the urgent voices of medics fighting against cold and time. The children were placed on makeshift cots near a pot-belly stove. Their small bodies shook violently as the heat touched their skin, as if thawing pain they had carried for days. The medics worked quickly, checking pulses, clearing airways, warming limbs with cloths dipped in heated water. The toddler, wrapped in the sergeant's jacket, drew everyone's attention immediately. His breath was shallow, his skin far too pale. A medic pressed 2 fingers to the child's neck, then looked up sharply. "He's barely hanging on," he whispered. The sergeant stepped forward. "Do whatever you can." "We will," the medic promised. "But he's been without warmth and food for too long. We don't know how long he was like this." The sergeant clenched his jaw. He hated that phrase, "we don't know." War created too many questions with no answers. The girl clung to Dawson's sleeve, tears streaking her face. She pointed frantically at the toddler, speaking in German, her voice cracking. Dawson knelt, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "He's safe now," he whispered. "They're helping him." But her eyes told him she didn't believe it. Not yet. Outside the tent, officers gathered quickly, trying to understand the situation. A lieutenant asked the patrol, "Where'd you find them?" "In the woods," the sergeant replied. "Alone. Under a broken cart. No adults. No sign of any." The lieutenant exhaled. "We've heard reports of families fleeing. Could have been separated. Could have." He stopped himself before finishing the thought. At that moment, a medic called out from inside the tent. "Sarge, we need you." The sergeant rushed in. The toddler's condition had worsened. His breaths came in short, desperate gasps. His eyelids fluttered. The stove heat wasn't enough. The medic surrounded him, working with a quiet, practiced urgency. "His temperature's too low," one medic said. "We're losing him." The girl sobbed harder, reaching toward her brother. Dawson held her back gently, trying to shield her from a moment no child should witness. The sergeant looked between the child and the medics. Something inside him broke open, a memory, a ghost, a wound he had buried beneath layers of duty. He remembered holding his own infant son years ago. He remembered the fever that came suddenly, the frantic hours, the doctor who arrived too late. He had buried that memory, buried it under war, under orders, under silence. But now, looking at this fragile boy fighting for breath, that memory tore through him with full force. "Move," the sergeant said quietly. The medics looked up. "Wrap him in everything we've got," he said. "Blankets, jackets, anything. And bring warm canteens. We're not losing this kid." The medics didn't argue. They grabbed every spare blanket, wrapped the child carefully, placed warm metal canteens along his sides to raise his temperature slowly. The sergeant sat down, cradling the boy in his arms, rocking him instinctively. The patrol watched silently, stunned by the raw tenderness of the moment. The sergeant whispered something only the child could hear, words spoken softly, words forged from grief and hope. Minutes felt like hours. The boy's breathing slowed, stabilized. His cheeks regained a hint of color. The trembling eased. The sergeant exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The medic checked his pulse again and nodded. "He's responding. Keep holding him like that." The girl rushed forward, placing a trembling hand on her brother's blanket. She looked up at the sergeant with gratitude shining through the fear in her eyes. And he, a man hardened by battles and loss, nodded gently. Not victory. Not relief. Just human connection. Outside, snow continued falling, but the forest no longer felt threatening. Rather, it felt like a distant world, a place they had pulled 3 lives away from. But danger had not disappeared. A radio operator burst into the tent, breathless. "Sir, German forces are pushing again on the East Road. We're to move civilians immediately. If they break through, this camp becomes a front line." The sergeant didn't hesitate. "Pack up. The children move with us." The lieutenant nodded. "They'll go to the rear medical station. Truck leaves in 5. The patrol helped prepare them, wrapping the children in thicker blankets, finding boots that fit, tucking small pieces of bread into their pockets. The toddler slept lightly, warmed enough to survive the journey. When the truck arrived, the medics carried the children inside. The girl, now calmer, held her brother securely. The boy sat beside them, eyes still wide but no longer filled with terror. Before the doors closed, the girl reached out and took the sergeant's hand. Her grip was small, cold, and shaking, but full of meaning. She whispered a single word in German. A word the sergeant didn't need translated. "Danke." The door shut. The truck rumbled forward, heading toward safety. The patrol stood there as it drove away, snow falling around them, rifles at their sides, hearts heavy with something beyond duty. They had survived the forest. They had escaped the ambush that never came. Instead, they had found something far more devastating. Proof that war destroys the smallest, most innocent lives long before the armies ever reach them. When the truck carrying the children disappeared beyond the snow-covered ridgeline, the patrol remained standing in silence, staring into the white distance where fear, innocence, and hope had all collided in a single frozen clearing. The Ardennes forest, which only hours earlier felt like a living enemy, now seemed strangely hollow. The branches no longer whispered danger. The wind no longer carried threats. It carried memory. The sergeant lowered his gaze and exhaled slowly. What they found in that forest had shaken something loose inside him, something he had kept locked behind duty, survival, and the brutal rhythm of war. He had expected an ambush, expected violence, expected soldiers with rifles. But instead, he had been forced to confront a truth far more painful. War does not choose who it breaks. As the patrol moved back toward their positions, the weight of what they had witnessed stayed with them. Their boots crushed snow softly. The forest felt less like a battlefield and more like a reminder of what had already been lost. Even the quiet seemed different now, less threatening, more sorrowful. Back at camp, orders resumed. Defensive lines had to be reinforced. Fuel had to be rationed. Watch rotations had to be set. The Battle of the Bulge did not pause for grief or reflection. But the men of that patrol carried a heaviness that no briefing could remove. Dawson sat by a fire that evening, staring into the flames as if searching for the faces of the children. "They never should have been out there alone," he murmured. No one disagreed. Ellis cleaned his rifle mechanically, but his hands moved slower than usual. "Just kids," he whispered. They were just kids. The sergeant didn't speak at first. He stood at the edge of the camp, looking toward the trees. He remembered the girl's hand gripping his, the toddler's faint breaths against his chest, the boy trying to act brave despite being terrified. He remembered too well his own child's fever, the stillness that followed, and the grave he had walked away from long before the war began. He closed his eyes. The forest stayed with him. Days later, word came back from the rear medical station. The children had survived. All 3. The toddler remained weak but stable. The girl refused to leave his side. The older boy had eaten his first warm meal in days. The patrol received the news with a mixture of relief and quiet pride. The war raged on, but in the midst of destruction, they had pulled 3 small lives away from its jaws. The sergeant didn't say anything when he heard the report. He simply nodded, turned away, and let out the breath he had been holding since the moment they found the cart. In a war defined by loss, that day in the Ardennes gave him something he never expected to feel again. Not victory, not triumph, but the fragile, aching reminder that humanity, though battered and buried, was still alive.